So welcome everyone, and over to Federica or Muthu or Laura. Sorry, I'm not sorry. I've just got a message.
Hello everyone, welcome. And then I would like to hand over to Laura, who's chairing the session. Laura, thank you very much for joining us today. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Muthu. I'm sharing. Right.
I think, Laura, that's in the right-hand side. You can click Share Content. That's next to the Participants button. So towards the right-hand side.
Grayed out the share. I can't select anything.
When you check Share Content, and I think Share Application or Screen.
Ah, yes. Okay, now it's blue. Okay, now I'm sharing, I think. I hope. Right. Are you able to see the welcome slide?
Yes, brilliant. Thank you so much, Laura. Okay, we are there.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's seminar. I'm delighted to be chairing this discussion today, and I would like to thank Muthu and Federica very much for the invitation to being here today. It's a very exciting opportunity to be part of this public policy seminar discussion series on the topic of science business co-creation in the digital economy. The next 60 minutes are planned as following. I'll be doing a brief introduction of my work at the OECD on a current project on co-creation, which sets the sort of framework within which we have received 2 research contributions that we'll be spending a bit of time on discussing today. The first one is a contribution from Muthu and colleagues who will be presenting her work on why do we need science-based co-creation. And then we have about a 10-minute presentation from Federica, who is also presenting research work on public innovation intermediaries and digital technology co-creation processes. And thereafter, I'd like to ask you to keep your questions because there'll be about 20 minutes time for discussion with you all. And I'll be taking, or whoever is your questions based, that will be taking your questions, and then we'll wrap up with conclusions. And that's the plan for about the next 60 minutes. Are there any questions at this point, or shall I directly continue with the part on the OECD project?
Yeah, I think you can, Laura, because I don't see any raising hands. So if you have any questions, participants, you may raise hands that you could see next to the button where you see the video. So yeah, Laura.
Could you keep an eye on the hands while I'm presenting? Sure. Because I just see my slides at this point.
Don't worry, Laura, okay. I'll do that. Thank you.
Super. Thanks so much. Right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you all the ongoing work in the OECD Working Party on Innovation and Technology Policy, which is the so-called co-creation project. I'm policy analyst and part of the TIP team that has been working on this project. On the next slide, you see a general overview of this project, which sets out to explore the distinct characteristics and also the policy implications of co-creation, which is the project defining as the process of joint knowledge creation between industry, research, and possibly other stakeholders, such as society. The timeline is a 2-year project, which started back in 2019 and which will come to an end at the end of this year in 2020. The questions that the project is addressing is structured in 3 ways, which is resulting in 3 work streams. The first question is on the characteristics of co-creation and the ways in which co-creation is co-creation from different from knowledge transfer, the more traditional ways of looking at knowledge transfer, and what, if any, are policy implications. And these questions are addressed in conceptual work on the co-creation topic, the first work stream of the project. The second question is focusing on the impact of public research and innovation and wider societal objectives. This question is being addressed via the collection of country case studies. And the third question in the project looks at country policy experiences and best practices in support of knowledge transfer and co-creation. So this third question is put a bit larger, and it is addressed in the creation or in an ongoing development of an online policy toolkit, which this project has also been focusing on. And because the seminar today will primarily focus on the first and the second work stream of the project, I'll quickly spend just a few minutes to share with you a very latest development in the project, which is the policy toolkit that we've been developing. And before I do that, I'd like to also point you to the URLs that you find on top of the blue workstream boxes, which where you can find more information on the overall TIP working party, as well as the specific TIP co-creation project. On the next slide, you see an overview of the Policy Toolkit homepage. And the idea of the Policy Toolkit is to bring together the rich work that the OECD has been doing in the last years on the topic of knowledge transfer, and now in the past 1.5 years, specifically on co-creation. You see a screenshot of the policy of the toolkit homepage on the slide, and I'd like to point you to two aspects, which is the possibility to access key materials, which consist, for example, of case studies going back as early as 2015, for example, and also other materials related to the work of the OECD and also other external institutions on the topic. The idea that this Policy Toolkit becomes the go-to hub in order to identify to find information on quantitative and qualitative nature on this topic area. And therefore, on the right-hand side, you see certain buttons that allow you as the user to start journeys related to key questions on the topic, on specific themes, as well as to explore people and organizations, as well as policy instruments of importance in the context of knowledge transfer and co-creation, as well as country-specific information. And in terms of the scope and the content of the toolkit, as of today, it consists of 8 specific so-called key questions that allow you to identify, for example, specific topic areas such as how to support the creation of academic spin-offs or how to enhance the commercialization of public research. It also consists of 21 pages on different actors that are relevant for knowledge transfer and co-creation, 24 policy instruments, 8 thematic pages, and a total of 52 country profiles. And this really is a living toolkit. In short, while, for example, we are currently developing content on the question of knowledge transfer and co-creation in times of COVID-19, and we're also working on including content on more sectoral perspectives, such as tech transfer in the space technologies, or work on collaborative platforms for converging technologies. Now, my next slide now switches from the toolkit that I briefly presented to you to the project contributions that we have received so far in the TIP co-creation project, and also to give you a bit of an overview on the conceptual framework, which is framing these different contributions. And on this slide, I've tried to summarize and to give you a very high-level overview of the very rich and very diverse contributions that the different countries have made. And I'd like to first focus your attention on the 5 sort of Olympic rings that you see in the center. And the idea here is to basically position the 10 country case studies that we have received so far with regards to the main aspect of co-creation that they focus on. But as you can see, for example, these aspects are as varied as co-creation initiatives focusing on industry-led or being industry-led or market-driven. Some of them focus on digital technologies. Others are very challenge-driven, and others are very strong component on society engagement or are intermediary coordinated. Now, the idea of these bubbles, these Olympic rings, are interlapping is the fact that, in fact, these co-creation case studies are not necessarily only focusing on this one aspect. So if I take an example, for example, the 1C initiative that we've received as a case study from Finland, we positioned that as having a strong aspect of being an industry-led initiative, because it's in fact a business ecosystem around maritime technologies. But there's also an aspect to it, which is a very strong orchestrating company that keeps this business ecosystem and the different actors together. So that means that this is a case study not only touching on the aspect of being a very market-oriented co-creation initiative, but it also focuses on being the aspect of being an intermediary coordinated activity. Another example is, for example, the contribution from the UK on the Wildlife Tech Hub, which we situated as being a sort of challenge-driven co-creation initiative, but at the same time, there's a very strong focus in this initiative on societal engagement around informing the public about the issue of illegal wildlife trade. Now, all of these contributions are in the project are sort of framed and are situated in the overall conceptual framework, which is designed around the definition of co-creation as being the process of joint knowledge creation between industry, research, and possibly other stakeholders such as civil society. And the reason that I'm repeating this definition at this point is because I believe we're going to have a bit of a discussion today around this definition. And I'd like to conclude, in fact, my short introduction at this point by pointing out the two research contributions that we've had as part of the co-creation project, for which we're very, very thankful. And they are, in fact, the focus of today's seminar as well. So the first research contribution is from Federica and her research team. It focuses on public innovation intermediaries and digital technology co-creation processes. And I look very much forward to Federica's presentation after Muthu. Muthu and her research team have been looking at science-based co-creation, which is work that addresses more the conceptual framework of the TIP co-creation project. And so without further ado, I would I'm now very, very keen to hear both presentations and then to engage in a discussion with you all. I now would like to hand over to you, Muthu. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think that's a fantastic introduction to the OECD's work. And also, thank you very much for highlighting where our work fits within the OECD's work. So let me now share the screen. So hopefully you could see now. Yep. Can you see me?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. So in terms of this work, I think first I would like to thank very much Laura Kreiling and their team for inviting us to write a conceptual framework on science-based co-creation. And they put the co-authors in touch who haven't worked together before. So the Margareta is here in the audience. And then we are very pleased with the outcome. And above all, we are enjoying the collaboration. So then a huge thanks to you. And second, I would also like to thank David from Innovate UK for inviting me to write the case study for the UK, which I will briefly present today as an example of science-based co-creation. So let me now talk about the conceptualization first. So the motivation behind the development of science-based co-creation is the lack of emphasis of past research on a collaborative approach across science, technology, and society that generates social value. So we often discuss the science industry collaboration generating economic value, but there is a lack of focus on social value creation. So we developed this specific concept of science-based co-creation in response to this gap. So our definition of science-based co-creation builds on the TIP's existing definition and also which aligns with some of the existing definition on co-creation. So there are two main characteristics of these existing definitions. The first, the science-based co-creation involves a very close working relationship between actors coming from different organizations. So these organizations may include universities, government, businesses, intermediaries, and also society. Second, they, in addition to engaging in knowledge transfer or exchange, they work together very closely by integrating their complementary assets. So we then build on this existing definition by adding the social value creation dimension. in order for a co-creation to be self-sustainable, the generation of both social and business value has to be key. Because if it only generates social value, for example, then it has to be dependent upon funding. But if it generates both social and business value, the social value creation could be sustainable because of the influence of the business value, that is money. And second, social value creation could be scaled up, again, because of the influence of business value. So here, then our contribution is to bringing this third dimension of the definition of co-creation, where we address the co-creation initiatives simultaneously generate social and business value. However, the generation of this social and business value could vary. So when we look at this variation, we have found three main dimensions in which the social and business value creation within a specific co-creation initiative may vary. So the first dimension is the scope of innovation. So for example, co-creation may generate value in terms of innovative technologies, knowledge or capabilities, and also combination of these different innovation types. So based on the scope of innovation, the success criteria for co-creation could vary. And also, co-created value, that is co-created business and social value, may reach to a larger group of beneficiaries or to a focused group of beneficiaries, depending on the initiative. And also, the balance between social and business value creation may vary in a spectrum with two ends. The predominant social value creation and predominant business value creation are in the two ends. And between these two ends, we could see different combinations of business and social value creation. So different initiatives may sit at different places of this spectrum. So before moving into talk more about the conceptualization and its implication, let me take an example of science-based co-creation. So this is the case study that we have developed for OECD. So this is the case that represents the UK. So each country would have a case study or maybe two, but this case study especially targeting the UK. So in this case study, as you could see, the several partners are working together to mitigate illegal wildlife trade. So this particular model is really interesting because this partnership is aimed at accelerating for startups who develop products and services to mitigate illegal wildlife trade. So most of the technologies these startups use are emerging from universities. So the startups work very closely with funders, technical infrastructure providers such as Microsoft and Amazon, and also the external network who are mostly the users of their technologies, as well as UK Catapult centers, the Digital Catapult and Satellite Application Catapult, which are intermediaries. That is part of the discussion Federica is going to have, in order to commercialize these technologies and also to develop new skills and also strengthen their business models. If you look at these technologies are mostly in the area of digitalization and big data technologies. So this co-creation generates business value in terms of scaling up businesses and social value in terms of mitigating illegal wildlife trade from the solutions developed, as well as the development of capabilities of these startup owners and also their teams, which would not have been possible otherwise. So there are several of these forms of co-creation initiatives are emerging, and they are different in terms of the nature of business and social value generated, as well as associated mechanisms leading to the success. Therefore, we developed this specific conceptual framework. The main motivation behind the framework is that one-size-fits-all model will not work because co-creation initiatives are different. Therefore, we wanted to understand what determines the heterogeneity of science-based co-creation. So here the heterogeneity we define in terms of the nature of social and business value co-created. So that I have already discussed on the basis of scope of the innovation, reach, as well as the prominence. And then we look at three main factors that would influence this heterogeneous value creation. The first factor is the decision to engage in co-creation. Because when it comes to co-creation, it is not a substitute for internal R&D, knowledge transfer or knowledge exchange. Actors should make a very careful decision as to which co-creation mechanism they should engage in to achieve which objectives. So this decision will influence the nature of resources each party would offer, as well as the nature of value co-created. Therefore, we look at different dimensions that should be considered when making this decision, but due to the time constraint, I wouldn't go into details. But there is a shorter version that we have published. I will provide you the link later on. And second, depending on the type of resources integrated, the nature of value co-creation could vary because partners may offer different types of tangible and intangible assets. And third, the management practices adopted during the co-creation initiative would determine their ability to generate specific forms of social and business value. Here in this diagram, the dotted lines indicate the further research avenues, as well as the lack of our understanding of how these different antecedents influence the nature of social and business value co-created during the science-based co-creation. So since I do not have very long time, this was a very brief explanation. Let me now quickly move into discuss the practical and policy implications of the framework developed. So the first, our discussion around the decision to engage in co-creation and its link with the nature of social and business value co-created provide useful insights on its suitability to address common challenges that we face. Because one party may not have relevant knowledge, skills, resources, and networks to address, for example, quite large challenges to achieve, for example, sustainable development goals or the urgency to respond to COVID-19. And also, organizations and policymakers should make a careful decision as to which objectives they should achieve via which type of co-creation initiative. And also, the decision to engage will be dependent upon the incentives provided to individuals. Since co-creation is risky, in businesses, it might be required to consider the risk when gauging the performance of individuals engaging in co-creation. And also in universities, the incentive system would influence someone's decision to engage in co-creation. Also, when it comes to policy, they could provide incentives for partners to engage in co-creation since it generates social value as well. So in terms of the types of resources that would influence the nature of social and business values co-created, so the designing of government and organizational policies on resources should consider which resources to be allocated to support which type of initiatives to achieve which objectives. And finally, regarding the effect of management practices on the nature of value co-created, it is important to make clear decisions on the suitability of partnership models to generate specific values. So, for example, government policy could influence the generation of these different partnership models and bring in international and national parties together, for example, to achieve sustainable development goals or to respond to COVID-19. And also policies at both organizational and governmental levels should understand which training needs to be provided and absorptive capacity to be enhanced to generate specific forms of social and business value. And also the both government and organizational policies on the offering of digital infrastructure, the designing of IP policies and associated advice should also be dependent upon the nature of social and business value co-created. So the last, the conceptualization of the nature of business and social value co-created and also specific dimensions that we have considered would provide a good framework for the performance matrix within organizations. Also evaluation criteria for policy programs and also dual value associated policy interventions. Okay, so this is a kind of a very brief summary of our contribution to OECD, both the conceptualization as well as a brief summary of the case study. And if you would like to check a summary of the conceptualization, not the case study, you will be able to find it by using this link. But we are also in the process of finalizing a journal article. And also I think Laura will talk more about taking this work forward. Okay, so let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Muthu. This was a really, really interesting presentation, and I'll be delighted to ask you some questions afterwards at the Q&A. For now, I'd like to hand over and hear about Federica's work and her research on public innovation intermediaries. Federica, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so let me just share my slides then. First of all, thank you very much for the introduction, Laura and Muthu, for presenting the conceptual framework of the project. This is a paper, well studied, that I am developing together with some colleagues. Annalisa Caloffi from the University of Firenze, Anna Kolovic from Neoma Business School in Paris, and Margherita Russo from University of Modena and Reggio Emilia in Italy. And I think Margherita and Anna are online today, actually, so that's good because they can also contribute to the discussion, perhaps at the end. And of course, we're very grateful to Laura, Caroline, and the OECD team for inviting us to contribute to this project. Now, we have heard from Muthu about the general conceptualization, of the concept of science-business co-creation in her paper. What we are focusing here is on a specific type of agent involved in the co-creation project, which are public innovation intermediaries. And in particular, we are looking at their involvement in projects that involve the setup of, the implementation of complex digital technological solutions. So we're taking a specific angle and we're looking at what does co-creation mean in this particular area, and what is the role of these particular agents, these public innovation intermediaries. There is a lot of work nowadays around innovation intermediaries and what role they play in innovation processes. How can they support companies in the process of digital transformation is a question that has emerged in recent years. We have not really seen so far a lot of research into the specific role of public innovation intermediaries in these processes, and in particular how they can support, companies in getting involved in the process of digitalization, particularly around these very complex emerging technologies that we now, connect with the concept of fourth industrial revolution. So technologies that are fully commoditized and which are complex, that are based on, they are multi-platform, multi-layer. Very often this kind of complex technological system need the involvement of many companies, each of which is providing a small part of the system, which then needs to be integrated. If you think about projects in the area of the Internet of Things, for example, you will need a multiplicity of companies to take part in the project, from companies producing sensors to those producing the overall, the sort of software platform, to the actual, the physical integration of the system. And then you will need a system integrator that is putting all the different layers together. And of course, what roles do public intermediaries play in the context of this project is quite an interesting question. When we look at intermediaries, what we have seen through our, this is what the literature has actually begun to acknowledge. So there are other studies which acknowledge this, but also something that we have seen in our own empirical research is that innovation intermediaries are changing their roles from simple networkers to co-creation of complex technological solutions. So initially, intermediaries, like, for example, if you think about things like technopoles or knowledge transfer centers or, competence centers, these kind of intermediaries were mainly focused on activities like networking. So, helping firms getting in contact with other firms, providing information, providing training, and even brokering, in the sense of helping companies understand what their technological needs were and helping them find a market solution for their technological needs. But what we are seeing nowadays is an evolution of these intermediaries, and they are coming to play more complex roles of actually co-creators of technological solutions. On the demand side, they help the client to better articulate what is their demand for technology. So what is the kind of problem that they need to solve through digital technology, and how they can, a technological solution can be put together to solve their need. On the supply side, we've seen intermediaries bringing suppliers together to produce complex technological solutions that then can be offered to clients. So we've seen them play this role of co-creation both on the demand side and the supply side at the same time. And we are wondering, what is the advantage then of having a public innovation intermediary play this role? Because when we look at this complex landscape of digital technologies, we find that there are private system integrators that perform the function of putting together complex technological systems. In particular, we were looking, in our interviews, we focused on Internet of Things projects, okay? We delimited the scope of our field by looking at Internet of Things. And when you look at it, there are companies which are performing a role of system integrators. So, for example, you've got the large companies providing key components of the technologies, for example, software platform providers and telecommunication companies. They will provide, they will in fact offer integrated Internet of Things systems to clients around their often proprietary technological solution. Telecommunication companies like Vodafone, for example, they have already a network of, a sort of mobile network installed, and what they're trying to do is they are augmenting their offer of connectivity with an offer of data analytics, the data collection and data analytics services. You have consulting companies, which companies can contact in order, and they will help them put it together, an Internet of Things system, for example. And we've also seen companies which produce goods for final users, trying to augment their product offering with additional database services, data collection and data analytics services, which then, enter into this realm of the Internet of Things that way. And the objective of these companies is generally to enhance their offer. So basically the data analytics services enhances the product that the company is offering. So for example, Monsanto, they will offer a service to farmers where they will help them collect data from their fields in order to help them optimize their purchasing of fertilizers. Or Bosch, it will offer a service to purchase of machine tools where they will collect data about the use of the machines in order to help these companies optimize the maintenance of their tools. So, is there a role for public intermediaries in this complex, space? And in our studies, through our empirical research, we argue. So, what we have found is that there are specificities of public innovation intermediaries that allow them to create both social and economic or business value. And which therefore aligns their role with that definition of science-business co-creation that Muthu provided earlier. Okay, their ability to actually combine social and business value sort of aligns them with this definition of co-creation. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the data collection. I cannot turn to my next slide, so let me see if I can do it this way. Okay. So we did semi-structured interviews with 20 respondents. We also analyzed a lot of secondary literature. We transcribed, coded, analyzed our data through thematic analysis. And as you can see, our interviewees were in France and the UK, so we focused on these two countries. We interviewed public innovation intermediaries, so PII are our public intermediaries. We interview policymakers, technologies experts in innovation policies in both countries. And I don't want to go too much into details, but basically in the UK we focused on technology catapults, and in France on Pôle de Compétitivité and also on the Institut Carnot-Curie as public innovation intermediaries that play this role that we of co-creators that I mentioned earlier. So what do we think are the specificities of public innovation intermediaries? Well, on the one hand, when you think about supporting clients in expressing their demand for technology, one of the advantages of public innovation intermediaries is that they are neutral with respect to the different technologies. So they don't have a preferred technological solutions that they want to build a system around. This is an advantage for the client organizations because it offers a broader variety of potential solutions and a greater possibility to customize the solution around the client needs. And in a way, this also has a social validity because if you kind of leave more open, more avenues open for innovation, and this facilitates the emergence of new and more effective technological solutions. So there is an advantage for companies to rely on the services of public innovation intermediaries to put together a solution. We believe that this advantage is particularly important for SMEs because SMEs are very often, not a very relevant market segment for private system integrators. They are too small. Their requirements are too specific and often too unusual to be serviced by a commoditized system. And therefore, they risk being left out from the implementation of complex digital technologies simply because they are not a very relevant market segment for larger system integrators. So the fact that public intervention intermediaries have a mandate to engage with a plurality of actors is an advantage in this sense because they want to engage with SMEs. Some of these intermediaries, for example, the French ones have a regional development mandate, and so they're very interested in engaging with SMEs at the regional level because they want to support regional development. They also are very keen to engage with collectivities, like municipalities, for example. So we have seen a number of examples of projects which were done together by innovation intermediaries with municipalities, for example, around things like smart mobility. And the fact that they are public innovation intermediaries can also provide an advantage in relation to these projects because sometimes municipalities are more keen to engage with the trusted local public intermediaries rather than with a large company. So they will have a system that is built, is more open, more flexible, is built around by integrating the activities of a number of different companies rather than relying on a single provider, which is more acceptable to local actors. And also very often they, as we've seen with a case study in France, having a local public intermediaries means that there are more local companies involved in the project, and this enhances the trust of the collectivity in the project itself. So, for example, just to give you an example of what these demand-led co-creation projects look like, a lot of these intermediaries engage in things like open innovation challenges, where they work with a company in order to try and understand what the company's problems is. So the public intermediaries here is very active. It's not a simple networker or broker. It's really trying to get into the project and to help develop the solution. So it's not just putting the company in contact with other companies. It's actually a very active participant and co-creator of the project. And we have seen that here, for example, in the context of open innovation challenges, what the public intermediary does is it really works closely with the company, tries to understand what the company's problems is, write the problem in the form of a challenge, and then put the challenge out to the network, to its network, which often is very large. Then it gets a lot of responses back, and then they select some of those, and then with this selected group of companies, they continue the process iteratively until they get to a final, until they get to a possible set of solutions, which then among which the companies will select one. Okay, the client company will select one. We've seen this happening both in the UK and French intermediaries. One of the UK intermediaries was also talking about proof of concept, which is going a step further. Once you've selected the technological solution, you actually do a pilot implementation. And again, you rely on, you have a vast network of companies you can tap into to develop this proof of concept. In the case of supply-led co-creation, this is another approach where actually the public intermediaries work with potential suppliers of a digital solution. They put the digital solution together and then they offer it to a client. And this is an advantage for the companies that participate in putting together this offer, particularly if they are SMEs, because they participate in a network that is very open, very flexible with other SMEs. They don't depend on the technological solution of a large provider, but they become sort of equal participants in putting together this solution. I'm going to give you an example to show you what this kind of project looks like. We've seen this in some of the French intermediaries, in particular one, who has been very active in putting together what they call a groupement of SMEs. So the public intermediaries put together a group of SMEs to create a technological solution, which is then offered to a large client. For example, one example are a group of SMEs in the automotive sectors, which have clubbed together thanks to the intervention of the public intermediary. So the intermediary was absolutely crucial in this process. The SMEs clubbed together to develop a technological solution around autonomous driving. So it was a technological solution which could be implemented in the car and help the car recognize objects in its surrounding automatically. These SMEs together, they then offer their technological solution to a large automotive company. So the automotive company is offered an entire value chain rather than a disconnected group of SMEs doing their own thing. And this was possible because the public innovation intermediaries did this job of putting this groupement together, okay? And this creates value for the participating SMEs, because if they acted individually, vis-a-vis the large client automotive company, they certainly would not have the ability to put together this value chain and also the bargaining power to them, they then would have against the company is much greater. Social value. The point is also that these are advantages that we've identified for the participating companies, but we argue that the involvement of the public intermediaries actually creates a lot of social value as well. First of all, they support technological diffusion to adopters that would normally be priced out. So the fact that they work with SMEs and they work with municipalities, for example, are, adopters which might not be easily served by private system integrators. And this is important, particularly in the early stage of technological development where there are few commoditized solutions. So you actually allow these actors to benefit from complex digital technology projects, which they might not do otherwise. And this, in a way, strengthens the transition to the new technological paradigm. It allows for the emergence of ecosystem around non-standard, often frontier technological solutions, because these systems that are put are very innovative, and they're very, they're very customized, so they're very specific and they're very non-standardized. And also, in a way, it accelerates the projects of innovation because it identifies practical challenges for companies to work with, particularly SMEs. It enables them to work them with real challenges and to come up and to collaborate with other SMEs in order to come up with original solutions. So there is a social value there because it does accelerate the process of innovation in these companies. Okay, because giving companies practical challenges to work with is very important. And because the challenges are very open, these companies have to innovate more, rather, compared to the situation where they are just part of a network of a private system integrator which just works with its own technological solution and wants a very standardized and commoditized set of inputs into the process. So this is what we've been focusing on. I'm going to close here then because I think we need to leave time for questions. I had a slide here about the resources that these intermediaries need to have in order to operate, but I'm going to leave that for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Federica. Thank you very much for taking us through your very interesting study focusing on the public innovation intermediaries. I've certainly learned a lot, and I have a list of questions here in front of me. But before I start, I'd like to now engage with everyone who's been listening to the two presentations and to my introduction. I'd now like everyone who has a question to raise their virtual hand or to write in the chat that you have a question if you don't find your virtual hand, and then I'll be happy to hear to discuss with you the questions that you have. I see the first hand from Jonathan Potter. Jonathan, what is your question?
Hello. Sorry to be a slow starter. It's very good. There are advantages of public innovation intermediaries that have been listed for creation of social value, neutral with respect to different technologies, engage with a plurality of actors. It seems to me that these are assumptions that need to be tested, that PIIs do have these features, and to look at how different types of PII will vary on those features. Because I find it naive in one sense that the PIIs and the agents within them do not have their own objectives other than facilitating the interests of co-creators. Doesn't the role of the intermediary depend on the incentive they face? I remember that evaluating the pole de competitivité many years ago, they were originally not keen to engage with SMEs. And it required a change in the regulation of the pole de competitivité to include SMEs. And then the last thing would be there's a question about funding of the PIIs. Do they take large firm funding as part of their co-financing, in which case they might be pursuing large firm interests?
Federica, you're muted.
Thanks, Jonathan. Do you want me to respond straight away, or do you want to take? Okay. Yeah, no, very good points, Jonathan. And in fact, we didn't get to the point of funding because one of the arguments that we are making is that these things do not just happen. There needs to be a plan behind it. And one of the points is funding. We argue that public funding is very important because it is precisely public funding that makes the difference for certain types of for the intermediaries being open to perform certain types of activities. And it's quite interesting because there is often a tension with these public intermediaries being pushed to gain a larger share of their funding from market sources. But actually, while they do so, then this might create these incentives to perform their some of the important sort of functions which are enabled by the fact that they have public funding. So there is a role for the policymaker there to actually very carefully understand what the role the intermediaries could play and to put the conditions there for them to do it. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
Great. I see some more questions. I'll take them in a second, but maybe also a comment to you, Federica, just linking on what Jonathan just said, because I also conducted research on regional innovation intermediaries in France in the regional tech transfer organization. And there I looked at the so-called SAT organizations here in France. And what you might want to look at also with regards to this funding question is the Programme Investissement d'Avenir here in France, which is the big government program which started many years back, but which also funded, for example, these types of tech transfer organizations. So that might be an interesting discussion for the French context that you might want to add to your paper. And now I'd like to give the floor to Loet Leidesdorf. Sorry for your pronunciation of your name. Could you unmute yourself and ask your question, please? Hello, Loet Leidesdorf. Can you hear us? Hello, we can see you. I cannot hear you. Sorry, I cannot hear you. Is anyone else? Federica or Muthu, can you hear the question? Okay.
No.
I'm very sorry. We could see you. We could see that you were quite talking, but we couldn't hear you.
Maybe, Laura, we could go
Yes.
to Gracia and then perhaps, I think he's having a problem in the connection. I could see that.
see.
So.
Okay, no problem.
Oh, he's there.
Now you're back, Loet.
We can't hear you.
Maybe could you ask your question in the chat, please? Just type your question in the chat and we'll take it from the chat in writing. And in the meantime, I'd like to ask Grazia, unmute yourself and to ask your question, please. Grazia, can you hear us? We cannot hear you.
Okay, I'll read the Lloyd question. I wondered why you were not including cognitive value in terms of research programs. Is it from me or to Federica? Is it like cognitive value in the intermediaries or co-creation? But if I talk about, okay, that's great. So in terms of the cognitive value, sorry, I did not have time to explain a lot. So we looked at it under the management practices section. And also in terms of cognitive value, another aspect that we looked at was the decision to engage in co-creation. So in both the sections, we look at the cognitive value in terms of decision to engage in co-creation, particularly by looking at and evaluating. So for example, one decision could be cognitive proximity, and you might decide to engage in co-creation because you have cognitive proximity or because you don't have cognitive proximity. And then in terms of the practices, again, that would have an influence in terms of the type of practices that you adopt. So, for example, if you do not have cognitive proximity, you might adopt different practices. And also that would influence the type of value that you generate. So thank you so much for highlighting it. And I hope, okay, that sounds again as social. Well, it does have both social and, okay. Margarita, would you like to come in? Because she's also one of the co-authors. She suggests something, Margarita?
No, I would simply say that I would add cognitive values as a result of the co-creation process, in the sense that you can change through that process the cognitive values for the individuals participating in the context of co-creation process. So it can play different roles as input, as you were saying, in the managing process, but also as a result of the process, you can have that impact.
Thank you so much, Margarita. Okay, so
great. Are there any other questions at this point? I'd like to go back to Grazia, who had raised her hand. I don't see your hand anymore. Feel free to ask your question in the chat. Oh, there's the hand. So you can hear us. Could you try again to ask your question, please? I cannot hear you. Could you try to ask your question in the chat, please? The chat opens on the right-hand side when you click on the purple colored button. You see a participant list, and next to it is the chat. Sorry, the chat is first and then the participant list. So feel free to ask your question there because we cannot hear you. There's a second hand from Margarita. I will take your question and I invite Grazia to type her question in the chat, please.
If I may add I would say linking Jonathan Potter's observation and your two presentations, I think that there is a critical issue when we consider innovation intermediaries with regard to their incentives. And to some extent is a crucial issue in dealing with a co-creation process as Muthu was presenting, in the sense that the system of incentives to some extent is completely different, I would say, for the individual actors participating to the process. And this must be made clear in advance, in the sense that they cannot be evaluated ex post as they were involved just in a business activity. Think, for example, in terms of the involvement of university researchers. If their involvement is assessed in terms of the contributions, they are generally that is generally considered in assessing the productivity of their activity. They could find a completely different framework when they are involved in a project which they are producing social awareness and not a top class paper. Okay. It's a completely different system of evaluation. So we have to consider this critical dimension in the entire assessment of those processes. And so the incentives for the individual actors participating, I think it could be an important part to be developed further. Thank you.
Many thanks for your comment, Margarita. This really links with a comment that I also made myself that I wanted to ask to Muthu and Federica, because I mean, in both of your presentations, you were emphasizing the importance of social value creation from the side of the public intermediary and the social value created in co-creation initiatives in general. And Muthu, you started your presentation saying that there's a lack of social value in co-creation, I wanted to challenge you on that and link sort of my comment back to what Margarita was just saying, that is it not the fact that the social value is there, but it's not measured because we currently have a measurement system and indicators that work with capturing the business and the economic value being created. But at the moment, the problem is capturing and expressing these the social and other types of value that are being created. So that links, for example, with future work. I think that needs to be done in this area, and it also links with the importance for policymakers in terms of thinking about evaluation criteria for co-creation initiatives. So maybe you want to share something on this point with
Yeah. Thank you very much, Laura. I think that's a very good question. I think what I meant to say was the empirical level, the phenomenon level. There are a lot of initiatives that they generate both social and business value. I think because most of the initiatives are emerging right now, they generate both social and business value. So what is lacking in the research is to give credit to that, and also particularly looking at these initiatives, how they generate both social and business value. And more specifically, even though we see that all these initiatives generate business and social value, first, we don't have a measurement, as you said, to gauge it. So that's why we kind of characterize these initiatives could vary in terms of the nature of social and business value co-created, and also more importantly, what are the determinants of this heterogeneity? Because the initiatives differ in terms of the scope of innovation, the prominence, and the reach. So all these have elements of business and social value, but we don't understand is what are the determinants of this heterogeneity. So this is more like the conceptualization and also the policy framework, because we tend to have, as also like Jonathan mentioned about the intermediaries section, we have policies which are more like one-size-fits-all model. But even within intermediaries, as Federica is highlighting, maybe there are differences which we need to take into account. So that is the kind of purpose of the framework. And thank you very much for the clarification question, Laura.
Federica, would you like to add something?
Yes, well, when it comes to intermediaries, I think intermediaries in principles are very keen to demonstrate that they generate social value because, their social value is an important part of their function and an important reason why they should be funded. And in doing so, they have two problems. One is the fact that policymakers tend not to be able to evaluate that component of value, so they tend to look at immediate outputs and immediate, outcomes of their activities, which might not necessarily be where their biggest value lies. And the other problem is that anyway, this value is very hard to demonstrate, and I know that, for example, from the interviews that we've had in the UK, we know that a lot of these intermediaries are working hard on trying to find ways of evaluating their process that demonstrate their social value, but it's not so easy to do because of the long-term perspective that is required, the scale of so it's not so straightforward. And these two questions are all interlinked. I think the question of the importance of generating value, the difficulty of measuring how social value is linked with public funding, and the fact that we live in a time in which public funding needs to always be, the validity of public funding is always questioned, and there is a tend to reduce it rather than increase it. So it's all they're all interlinked questions in a way. And if there was a way to demonstrate social value easily, then it would be easier for these intermediaries to justify what they're doing, but it's not so straightforward.
Yeah, but I guess it's always nice to close the seminar thinking about future research work and also contributions where research can work on the conceptual foundations, and then thinking about translating them into practice and into for example policy relevant or management relevant recommendations. And I think this is definitely an area of work where I think both of your studies that we've heard about today really make an important way and point to these important issues, and For example, with the presentation that we heard from Muthu today, I think really the fact that you've disentangled the dimensions, the scope, the reach, and the prominence are things, for example, that we, having collected these case studies as part of the co-creation project that I mentioned at the beginning today, that could be a really, really interesting way of actually plotting and assessing the extent to which economic and social value is being created, and a way of being able to then differentiate between the different kinds of value being created in these 13 initiatives, and certainly also going forward with more in potentially other settings. So I think this could be really interesting discussions in terms of future work. Is there anything that you would like to add with regards to future avenues in your research? Because I don't see any more questions. Sorry, I wanted to mention I don't see any more hands from participants at this point. I have a quick look at the chat, but I also don't see any question there.
Yeah, I think in terms of future research avenue, it is mostly to understand these the dotted lines that we have highlighted in the conceptual framework. I think that's where our future research avenues lie. So over to you, Federica, if you would like to add.
Yeah, so one thing we are trying to do is we're working a bit on if intermediaries are to play this role, how do they need to change themselves to play this role better? So that's the other line that we're trying to. So here we're trying to discuss, what is the potential value and role of intermediaries in co-creation, but actually, those that are successfully doing so, what resources are they using and how they are changing their competences, the structure, and so on, to actually be better able to play this role. And we think this is quite a promising, promising line of research.
So you're looking, for example, at the level of the practices adopted by managers in these.
Yeah, I mean, we are looking at practices. We're looking at, at the moment we're looking at things like how do they develop legitimacy, how do they build trust, the kind of thing that they are needed to operate. And then practices could be another one, actually, which we haven't really looked at so much so far, but there's another issue.
Fantastic. Well, are there any more? Oh, there's a question, a hand from Margarita at this point.
I'm sorry, it was a thought. It was the idea that, complementary to what was Federica saying, the point is that not only they change their competencies, but the mandate will change. So the intermediaries are to some extent answering to a different mandate. And so it is important to understand, along with the changes that Federica was mentioning, to which extent I would say the framework in which they operate is changing because the mandates are changing for them. So the interlinking between those dimensions is quite intriguing and they can be different across countries. So we'll see what will happen, what will emerge. So sorry.
No, absolutely. And also, Margarita is very involved in both projects. So you have ideas of future directions too, of course.
Well, yeah. I have the privilege of asking questions in both projects. So it is very interesting. Thank you.
Great. Well, I just had a look at the time. We are now 10 minutes past the scheduled time. If it's okay with you, Muthu and Federica, I would wrap up with some observations and maybe some future ideas on how to take this discussion forward. So thank you very much, everyone, for staying till the end of this really, really, really interesting seminar. Thanks to the Birkbeck College for making it possible to have this virtual discussion on the topic today. Thank you for inviting me along and for the possibility to present the TIP co-creation project at the OECD. I'd like to invite everyone who's interested in the project to feel free to email me on it. If you're interested in the links that I showed, I'm happy to share them with you all. From the side of the OECD project, we are looking as well after the summer holidays to launch also from our side a few seminars on targeted areas. We'd be happy to invite you along to these. And thank you also for Jonathan, Wade, for Margarita, to making this also a very, very engaging discussion and a conversation to continue and to take forward. With regards to the case studies that the OECD TIP co-creation project is collecting at the moment, that I mentioned at the beginning of the seminar, they show very, very rich and diverse. They show inside the diversity that co-creation initiatives can take, and I think this diversity and this knowledge that needs to be shared broader. So one of the things going forward in the next couple of months from our side, from the OECD Secretariat, is finalizing the case studies together with the authors and then making them publicly available to you all, so that Muthu and research team, you can then dive into the details and, for example, apply the framework that you presented today, and therefore also contribute to the discussion on co-creation going forward. The discussion is going to continue, and in 21-22 we're currently setting up the follow-up project on this co-creation project. So the conversation will continue in this regard. Also, for example, one of the things we're looking to think about is the role of the international organizations. So far, we have very much looked at national initiatives and national actors, but a question obviously in the field is thinking about the role of international organizations, and of course the relevance in terms of recommendation implications that can be derived from these observations for policymakers, because they are important framework actors that set framework conditions and regulation and incentives that we also talked about today. So this touches a bit up on the future work that we from the OECD and the TIP are looking to do, and we very much welcome the contributions from Federica, from Muthu, and from the respective research teams. We look forward to engaging in future collaboration and to stay in contact in these formats and in these discussion points. So without further ado, if there are no more virtual hands, I would like to wish you all a good continuation of your afternoon. It would be fantastic to meeting you all one day back in person. So stay healthy, stay safe, and have a wonderful summer.
Thank you very much, Laura. Fantastic chairing of this session. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you from me as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.